Hello, welcome to our second assembly about VE Day, because tomorrow is the 75th anniversary of the Victory in Europe Day that marked the end of the Second World War in Europe. And as we'll find out a little bit later on, of course, it wasn't actually the end of the war completely, because it still went on in the Far East. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. But you might remember from last week that from the picture that you can see on the screen now, that at the end of the Second World War, VE Day, there was lots of celebrations in London and across the country. And you can see here the King and the Queen and Princess Margaret and Princess Elizabeth, who's now our Queen, out on the balcony of Buckingham Palace. And the next picture, you can see Winston Churchill waving to the crowds. He was the Prime Minister, you might remember, at the time of the end of the Second World War, and it was him who announced that the war was over. But for many families, that experience was quite different. And I'm going to tell you now a little bit about something that my aunt wrote a little while ago about her experiences of the end of the Second World War and VE Day. Because she was at the end in May the 7th, 1945. She was 14 years old, and she was at a school right up in the north of Scotland, in St Andrews on the east coast of Scotland, and she was a day girl at a boarding school. And she remembered that the whole school was given a holiday from lessons, and they spent the day in sports activities in the school grounds. But all the celebrations passed her by because she was one of the girls sitting the Oxford School Certificate exams, which are a bit like GCSEs are today. And special day or not, the exams had to go on. So as a special treat, the members of staff who were invigilating the exam had somehow found some sugar and butter and made some toffee, and each of the girls had a celebratory piece of toffee before they started their exam. So there were no special celebratory meals there at the time, because food rationing was quite severe, and their own rations were reduced further just after VE Day, a few days later, because the government decided that they should send the little spare food that the country had to the starving people in Holland. Because don't forget, as well as celebrating the end of the war in this country, for Germany, it was a very different experience. The Nazi Party, who had been in power for about 9 years and had really caused a lot of the problems in Germany and then throughout the rest of Europe and indeed the world, had crumbled. And Germany was now facing a very uncertain future. So it was a very different experience for them in that country as well. But you can see on the slide that is in front of you now that there was another member of my family who was involved in the Second World War. And this was my grandfather, whose name was Stuart Jolliffe. And you might be able to see from the picture maybe a bit of a resemblance between us. I'm not sure about that. But there he is in his full naval uniform. So he was my aunt's father. And the reason that she was in St Andrews in Scotland was because the family were there, because he was basically stationed there. But at the time of the end of the Second World War, he was actually on a ship called HMS Implacable, which is the picture you can see on the slide there. And his job, right at the end of the war, was to go and collect prisoners of war from Japan. So all through the southeast China area and the South China Sea, prisoners have been taken by the Japanese, and sometimes they were taken back to Japan. And when Japan, the war ended in Europe, it wasn't long before they knew also that it was going to end in Japan. In fact, that didn't happen until August 1945. But my grandfather was responsible for collecting prisoners of war from Japan and taking them to Australia, and from there organising taking them back to their own country. So they sailed in HMS Implacable from Australia all the way to Canada to drop some Canadian prisoners of war back, and American prisoners of war, and then eventually he came back to this country. And my aunt remembers him telling her that the aircraft hangars were converted into sort of dormitories, and it became almost like a hospital ship, because they had to the prisoners of war had been so badly treated, they needed medical help before they were able to kind of go back to their own country. So all the airplanes flew off ship, and they used the space instead to make space for the prisoners of war. And because they hadn't had very much food to eat whilst they were prisoners, they had to be really careful about how they sort of reintroduced food to them. And it must have been incredibly tempting for those people who had not been fed for several years to want to eat everything, but they realised that they had to kind of limit that and gradually let them eat more and more. And my grandfather was responsible for overseeing that process and making sure that they gradually built up their strength and the food that they ate. These are his medals. You can see them on the screen there. They range from right at the end of the First World War, because he joined the Navy right at the end of the First World War, through to the Home Guard, which is this medal here, which he was given for services to looking after this country after he retired, when he came back from HMS Implacable. And the others, the ones here, are his Second World War medals from different parts of the world, because he was also responsible for the convoys coming across from North America to this country during the earlier part of the war. So those are his medals, and they're very important kind of part of our family history. I'm going to close this assembly now by saying the prayer that I said last week, but I think it stands saying again, as we remember the sacrifice that many people made in all sorts of ways at the end of the Second World War. And we think as well about the people who have made sacrifices in this year, as they've looked after other people, and they have made sure that everybody is safe and well, but at the same time maybe have suffered themselves. So as usual, I invite you to join in with an Amen at the end of the prayer if you want to, but if you don't want to, that's fine. Just think about kind of all the things that have happened to this country this year, and also to remember the 75th anniversary of VE Day. Dear God, thank you for all those who fought to bring peace during the Second World War. Thank you that peace eventually came. Please be with all those who are living in areas of the world that are affected by wars today. Please help us to do our bit in creating peace wherever we are. Amen. It just remains for me to thank you for watching this video, and to wish you a very happy bank holiday weekend. We look forward to seeing you back at school very soon. Goodbye.